All right, everybody, welcome back to the World Cup analysis video cast. I am Galen Clavio. It is a good thing to be back with you here. And for our American audience, I'd like to wish you all a happy 4th of July. Always good to be celebrating our independence. And what better way to do it than by talking about the world's game? Unfortunately, we're not in the World Cup this year. We've talked about that, but we've gotten a chance to watch some really great soccer. And I'm excited to get a chance to talk with you about everything that we've seen so far and also get a chance to talk with you quite a bit about what's going to be going on here as we approach the quarterfinals. We get a couple of days off, which is always a nice thing to kind of reset after all of the drama that the round of 16 provided. And then, we launch back in earnest on Friday as we tackle the quarterfinals Friday and Saturday, and then we don't have a whole lot of soccer left. Within 8 days of that, we'll be crowning our 2018 World Cup champion, which really does seem hard to believe given that we just started this, a month ago, not even. So it has gone by very quickly. There's been a lot of stuff to talk about. We've got a lot of things to talk about here. First of all, let's go ahead and just quickly recap what happened in the games that occurred yesterday. As we had our final two matches before we got to the quarterfinals, and we certainly have a lot to talk about there. Before I get to that, if you would like to contribute to the conversation, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to tweet me at Dr. GC. I've gotten several people who have tweeted me there, and we've got predictions on the quarterfinals. We've got questions as far as what we expect to see coming up in this round. We've got questions about what happened in the last round, so feel free to jump in on that. You can also jump in on the Periscope chat. I am monitoring, and I'm looking forward to getting comments and questions from you there as well. So either of those will work. Looking forward to getting those comments from you. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about, as I mentioned, the games that occurred yesterday. Really just kind of an odd set of circumstances as far as the two games were concerned. I think one went very much the way that we thought it would, and the other one did not really go the way that we thought it would, at least not in terms of what the injury situation looked like ahead of time. Let's start with the one that was a little more predictable, Sweden versus Switzerland. This was a really fun game. Despite the fact that there was only one goal scored in this game, I think you could make the argument that it might have been the most entertaining game and the most well-played game between two sides of the whole round of 16. Certainly you had better dramatic moments in some of the other games, but this was really just a lot of fun from start to finish. It was fairly evenly matched in terms of scoring opportunities, but it was a very one-sided game possession-wise. The Swiss did a lot more with possession than the Swedes did, but the Swedes really made their chances count a lot more. And, ultimately they got lucky on the shot that went in, but the fact that they continued to probe, continued to kind of pick their spots, really ended up paying off for them in the end. And I was a little bit surprised. I really thought that Switzerland had what it took to beat this particular Swedish side and go through. Certainly they had more in attack, but Sweden was better organized. And every time Switzerland looked like they had something going, they would get blunted at the very end of it, which I thought was very interesting. And I think it's something that bodes well for this Swedish squad moving forward. It seems like every World Cup will get at least one side that's particularly well organized defensively, that doesn't make a tremendous amount of mistakes, or the mistakes that they make are able to be quickly mitigated. And that team's able to go farther than we think that they are going to be able to. I don't know if Sweden can necessarily advance any further than what they've already done, but they've certainly put themselves in a good position to do so. And it's something that, at some point we have to look at the Swedish side and say, perhaps we underestimated them. The way that they played against Germany kind of got erased at the very end because they allowed the goal. And certainly you look at that South Korean side and the way that Sweden played against them. And, my argument at the beginning was, well, Sweden didn't look very good in that game. Maybe South Korea just really was better than we thought they were in this tournament. And they were able to get the Swedes to play a more regressive style, because they certainly looked very good against Mexico, and they certainly looked very good against Switzerland. So good for Sweden, back in the quarterfinals for the first time since 1994 when they went all the way to the semifinals. That was, of course, the World Cup that happened in the United States. Let's jump to the other game, the one that everybody, at least stateside, I think, was focusing on, and that was England versus Colombia. My fears for Colombia were realized in this before we even got to the start of play because there was no James Rodriguez available, and that really took, I think, a lot out of this Colombian side in terms of what they were able to do offensively. You know, obviously Rodriguez has been bothered, I think, pretty consistently by injury. You know, that goes through club season as well. And, keep in mind, he had to come in as a sub in the first game of the tournament. He played very well in the second game, but then injured himself again in the third game. So there was an open question about whether he'd be out there at all. And honestly, I think Colombia, it was a very mixed bag as far as this game was concerned. Because, some random noises there as I dropped something off the table. That was not for dramatic effect, I promise. I think that, Colombia, they had some good tactical ideas in this. They really bothered England in terms of getting their offense underway. Their crosses weren't connecting particularly well. England was really struggling, I think, to find, the passes that they needed to string together, particularly as the game wore on. They really struggled to get the ball to Harry Kane. They struggled to move it forward, and I like a lot of that had to do with what Peckerman did from a tactical perspective. He was playing almost like a midfield diamond formation, it seemed like, in that game, and it really it created issues that England's going to have to figure out how to fix as they move forward, because it really stymied what had been up to that point a pretty free-flowing offense from this England squad in the World Cup. But on the flip side, I think that the problem that Colombia had was that they didn't believe in themselves in this game. And I mean that from this perspective. I think even without James Rodriguez, Colombia had all of the elements required to win this game straight up against England. They still had Falcao at the front of their attack. They still had a very, very solid defense. Davinson Sanchez played a great game in this game. Mina had a pretty good game. He had some pretty glaring mistakes and then made up for them all at the end of regulation. But, for almost the entire second half, and I think you could even make the argument it went back earlier than that, Colombia didn't play this game straight up. They didn't have a lot of attacking ideas. They weren't positive. They spent almost all of their time agitating, acting like basically hockey pests to some degree. They were constantly complaining to the officials. They were constantly trying to goad the English players. And look, to be fair, England's players, started engaging in a lot of that as well as the game wore further and further on. But this was very much a dark arts sort of game from Colombia, and I didn't think it needed to be. I really felt like they had enough in the tank that they could have gone head-to-head with England and probably come away as the victor, because they really did stymie England tactically for large stretches of the game. They ended up paying for some of their issues in the box. They foul Harry Kane. He ends up getting the penalty. And, honestly, England played fine. I mean, they did start to lose their connection between midfield and attack at about the 65, 70-minute mark, and they never really got it back, and it led to them playing on their heels. And look, I do give Colombia credit because at the very end, they forced the issue, and they got themselves a corner, which ended up turning into the goal that tied it up and sent it into extra time. And that, everybody talks about the header, and the header was certainly excellent from Mina, but the more important play was the kick that was taken that caused the save to be made by Pickford that he didn't need to make. That shot from 35 or 40 yards out, that forced the corner kick, and that led directly to the goal. And that to me, like, Colombia could have been doing that for 20 or 30 minutes, and they didn't. And so I think it's unfortunate for them because they certainly were the better side in extra time. England looked completely deflated. They looked completely on their heels. And I thought that Colombia did a really good job of taking advantage of that, but they couldn't penetrate the defense at that point. And I think England really deserves a lot of credit, not just for sustaining through that, but also getting themselves back together again Substitutions didn't work out that well. They dropped Eric Dyer in and tried to move Jordan Henderson forward, and Dyer was not up to game speed for really almost the entire time that he was in there. I understand why they did it, but then also bringing Vardy on for England, I felt like it completely disrupted whatever offensive flow they might have had. And the offense basically for England degenerated into Vardy taking runs up the right side that went nowhere. And so it really, I don't know if there was just a fatigue factor or a belief factor or whatever, but I think Gareth Southgate has to figure out a way to get more out of his squad in those situations as we move forward. Otherwise, they're going to run into a team that isn't struggling as much as Colombia was in terms of getting their offensive movement put together. But, you go to the shootout, and look, gave England a lot of credit, a lot of psychological demons for that England side, and they managed to persevere through it. Great save by Pickford. We've had two really incredible saves in penalty shootouts here over the course of the last few days. Obviously, the Akinfeev save in the Russia-Spain game, and then that last save by Pickford where he's like having to stretch his hand back as he's diving to his right, and he manages to get a hand on the ball and keep it out of the net. So, good for him and good for that England squad, able to overcome and knock the shots in when they needed to on the penalty shootout. So they go ahead and advance, and I think this was a good game for England if you're pulling for England, because it creates doubt, not in the idea that they can't advance, but it creates doubt in the idea of, wow, we can't just cruise through this. We had a lot of questions before the knockout stage about how good was England really, because their two wins were not against very good teams. And the idea that they were going to have to play a much tougher team really came to life in this contest, as they had to take on a Colombian side that certainly had a tremendous amount of talent. And now the question is, how do they approach things moving forward? You certainly have to like the road that's set up for this England squad, but they need to take the lessons out of this Colombia game and figure out how to apply them in a way that's going to give them a better sense of how to score and how to move the ball when they run into tactical situations that they're not familiar with or not comfortable with. So let's go ahead and dive in and look a little bit at the bracket here. And then I'm going to lay out a couple of things that I have in terms of my thoughts on the games and my thoughts on how things are going to be moving forward. I do want to tackle a couple of questions here before we get to that point. We had some questions here. One of them was from Dan Carell. How do you expect the teams who had to go 120 minutes, parentheses, England, Russia, Croatia, will do in the quarterfinals? Also, no Casemiro for Brazil. That's an interesting point on Casemiro. I think I don't know if it's going to matter as much as we might think, but it is an interesting point. But let's talk about the first question, which is how do teams do that had to play the 120 minutes? So I went back and looked at the results that we've seen out of teams that have had to do that. Now, you go back to 2006, there were only two teams that played 120 minutes in the knockout stage. Both of them ended up losing in the next game. However, one of those teams was Argentina, and they lost to Germany in a shootout. So they were able to go the full 120 minutes again, and I don't think they lost the shootout because they played 120 minutes the game before. In 2010, again, we only had two teams that played 120 minutes in the knockout stage. Both of them lost. No, I'm sorry. Yes, they did both lose. But there were some mitigating circumstances in both. One of them was Paraguay, who was probably the weakest team in the quarterfinals and had beaten themselves a weak team in the knockout stage in Japan. They ended up losing to Spain 1-0. Spain ended up going on and winning the title that year. That was not... I mean, there's an excuse there other than, we played 120 minutes. The other team that played 120 minutes in the knockout stage in 2010 and lost was Ghana, who went 120 minutes against Uruguay. And if you'll keep in mind, they probably should have won that game if Luis Suarez hadn't stuck his hand out and kept the ball from going into the net. Because they ended up missing the penalty shot that came as a result of that, and then they ended up losing in penalties afterwards. So, even though they lost the game, it took some pretty extraordinary actions for Ghana to not advance and get to the semifinal. Now, 2014 was a very interesting setup as far as the knockout stage and the 120-minute game. There were actually 5 teams that played 120 minutes and then went on to the quarterfinals. And of those, 3 teams won. And of the 2 teams that lost, one of them lost to a team that played 120 minutes. So Brazil played 120 minutes in their game in the round of 16. They ended up winning their next one. Germany played 120 minutes. I had forgotten about that one altogether, but they ended up, of course, advancing and winning the whole thing. Argentina played 120 minutes and then won. The game that they won was against Belgium, who played 120 minutes against the United States. And then the only team that lost to a team that hadn't played 120 minutes was Costa Rica. They went all the way to penalties against the Netherlands. And so, again, they played the full amount of time. So when I look at that, I would hesitate to bias your bets on the next round based upon who played a lot of minutes during this round. I think a far greater thing to keep in mind is who's missing who, due to injury, due to yellow cards, who's out basically during the quarterfinals. And that to me, I mean, even though we've had some difficult playing conditions in terms of weather, it seems like teams are regenerating fairly well. Did not see, any team that really looked completely out of gas. Maybe the closest was England at the end of that game versus Colombia, and I don't think that had anything to do with the temperature, because I believe that game was played in St. Petersburg, and it was only about 65, 70 degrees for that game. So it is interesting to keep an eye on at least, but if you look at the teams that played 120 minutes, 2 of them play each other, and the other one in England is going into a game versus Sweden where they're probably not going to have to keep a breakneck tempo if they don't want to. So I think that helps all of those teams out. Other questions and comments that we had from Twitter. Kevin Kernan asked, "Is it coming home?" This has been, for those who aren't familiar, this is the kind of the I think almost ironic catchphrase that was started in England that started to gain a lot of momentum. This idea that I guess the World Cup is coming home to England. I would say no, but I think they've got as good of a chance as anybody right now. Question from, let's see, we had Craig DeChemin, he's got a couple of them in here. Love to hear a podcast on how or why each team in the quarters can win. There are 4 favorites: France, Brazil, Croatia, and England, but others can win. Uruguay and Belgium are talented. Sweden are super disciplined. Russia's on home turf. I think, you brought up a lot of good points. I would say, if you want to break down each of the individual teams, I'm going to do that in just a second. We'll jump to that. Actually, we'll just go do it right now. That was my predictions here. I want to get to the right. There we go. Okay, so ignore what just popped up there. So if we look at the quarterfinals and the teams that are in the quarterfinals right now, why can each of these teams win? Well, Uruguay can win because they're very organized at the back, and they have, theoretically, they have 2 really, really top-level offensive players in Suarez and Cavani. And I think more than anything else, they believe that they can do it. The idea that Uruguay, they've had this great run in the World Cup, that's a group of players that doesn't believe that they're going to go out and lose. And I think that that's a really valuable commodity, particularly when you get to this stage of the tournament. And I think that as far as Uruguay's identity is concerned, basically, you're talking about a team that is really, really solidly built front to back. There's not a lot of wasted possession. There's not a lot of wasted space. There aren't a lot of players that aren't supposed to be out there. And it's a small country, so I think there's a familiarity in terms of how those players play with each other. They've been just incredibly consistent over time. You want to talk about France. What is it about France that makes us think that they can win? Well, I mean, it's that they're probably, depending on your feelings on Brazil, they're probably the most talented team left in the field. And certainly they're a favorite against Uruguay, and maybe even more so because of some injury news that we've gotten from Uruguay. But, France, if you just look up and down their roster, at least among their starters, they just have so much talent at every position. That talent hasn't necessarily been used to its fullest extent, although certainly the Argentina game was a step in the right direction. But, if you look at this France squad, you have to think, well, even if they fall behind in a game, they have the offensive firepower to get out in front. If they get ahead in a game, it's very difficult to break down their possession and their defense in order to get in there and score the goals that you need. And even if you're in good position, they have a very, very good keeper. So, I look at France and I say, this is a team that many people, myself included, thought was the odds-on favorite to win the World Cup before it started. Nothing about that has changed. Many of the same arguments go for Brazil, and I think the argument for Brazil is that they're getting stronger with every match that they play. They looked very good in that third game of the group stage against Serbia. They looked very good in their knockout stage game against Mexico. They just dominated the Mexicans in the second half of that game. And there's no reason to think that won't continue. This is a Brazil squad that's got something to play for, too. They were knocked out very, very infamously in the 2014 World Cup at home by a ridiculous scoreline. There's a lot of pride in Brazil over their football team, and there's a lot of pride in those individual players. They've got a chip on their shoulder that maybe no other team has. And they're certainly playing like it, I think, to some degree. Whereas France, who probably should have a chip on their shoulder after losing in the final of the 2016 Euros, which they were hosting, we haven't really seen a chip on the shoulders of the French players. Like they certainly played well and scored a lot of goals against Argentina, but I think that was as much due to Argentina not being very good as it was to France deciding, hey, we're going to hunker down and really play hard now. Belgium, they've obviously been, the hipster team to support. Although I don't even think that's fair in this tournament because they've been around too long to really be a hipster squad. That's a really talented team. They're just unproven. And that might be something that's dangerous as we move forward, not for Belgium, but for other squads, because you really kind of don't know what to expect coming out of this Belgian side. They certainly have the talent to beat any team in the tournament at this point. They've got an excellent striker in Lukaku. They've got world-class players, in most of their positions, and they've got a really, really strong spine. And those are things that if you're going to win a World Cup, if you go back and look at World Cup winners, many of them have shared those characteristics. For Belgium, the big thing is, can we tackle our own inhibitions about, being good at this high stage? And certainly they didn't get off to a great start in the World Cup knockout stage. That game against Japan demonstrated that they still have a long way to go mentally, I think. And they made some changes, and those changes ended up working out for them, and they ended up winning it at the end because they were very talented. But they were also largely able to out-talent that Japan side. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that against any of the teams that they face on their side of the bracket moving forward. Moving to the other side of the bracket, I think Craig mentioned it, and it's true. Russia can win the World Cup because Russia's at home. And yes, look, there's been some questions about, does this Russian squad, have some chemical advantages? Is there a doping program going on? Look, they've run further than a lot of teams. There have been individual players on other teams that have run further than any individual Russian. I think the thing about Russia was that they've played a smart game against the Spanish in a way that the Spanish themselves did not play smart. The idea that Russia, is winning because they're at home, I think is a stronger narrative than the idea that Russia is winning because they're like doping or having like some kind of help there. Certainly every little bit can count when it comes to World Cup, but you're also talking about huge gulfs in talent and ability. And I think that even though, we've seen Russia perform well up to this point, they're the longest of long shots of the remaining 8 teams. That doesn't mean they can't win it, though. Because their goalkeeper is playing really well right now, and their defense has been solid enough, and that's been helped by the fact that tactically they're just going pure counterattack right now. They're picking their spots. They're not worrying about possession. They're letting the other teams kind of do whatever they want. And then when they have opportunities, they get forward and they get offensive scoring opportunities. It's not terribly different from what Sweden's doing, except Sweden, I think, has a little more talent across the board. You can ride that formula to a World Cup final. We've really not seen a team win a World Cup that way, but we've seen teams win other tournaments like that. I mean, go back to Greece winning in the Euros in 2004. That was not a talented Greece team as far as their attack was concerned, and that was a Greece team that didn't even make the World Cup in 2002. But they figured out a way to play a very compact defensive style that shifted and molded itself according to its opposition. And then they looked for set pieces on which to nick goals, or they would live off of crosses and passes into the box. And I think Russia has a similar path that they could potentially do. And the thing with Russia is, none of the teams on their side of the bracket are world beaters by any stretch of the imagination. They've all got flaws, and it's a World Cup where I think the cream has not really risen to the top in the same way that we've seen in some other tournaments. And so I think Russia certainly has a chance at pulling out a victory, not just in this Croatia game, but moving forward. Let's talk about Croatia. Croatia, I think they're kind of an odd duck right now because we don't know what to make of them. They looked really good in the first stage of this tournament. They didn't look so good against Denmark. Now, was that mostly Denmark playing at a high level, or was that Croatia revealing itself as not a serious side? They're going to be the favorites against this Russian squad. They've got one of the best, if not the current best, central midfielder in the game right now in Luka Modric, and they've got a bunch of players that aren't afraid to get physical. They also have some attacking ability. And again, you look at the rest of the teams in their group, and it's hard to find their side of the knockout bracket. You look at any of those teams, who's got an overwhelming talent advantage over Croatia? Nobody. And I think you get to a final and anything is possible. So I look at this Croatian side and I say it probably isn't going to happen for them, because I feel like we see teams like this in the World Cup pretty regularly that looked pretty good in the group stage, looked a little iffy in the knockouts, then maybe even make it to a semifinal, but eventually are undone. But rarely do those sorts of teams have a guy like Luka Modric on their squad. And so that's something that I'm going to be really keeping an eye on moving forward with them. Getting back to the bottom side of this bracket, why could Sweden win? I mean, it's a similar story to Russia, except Sweden's more organized, and Sweden is, I think, slightly more talented at every position, and in some cases significantly more talented at every position. They're not, like, if you look at the really organized sides, that's Uruguay, then Sweden, and I don't even think Russia's particularly well organized, but they've done well with it, at least in the Spain game. But we also saw Russia fall apart against Uruguay. I like this Sweden squad. There's something intangible about them. They seem to have some belief in themselves. Now, they're going to be missing, I think, at least one key player in this quarterfinal. Lustig picked up the only yellow card in the whole game for Sweden against Switzerland, but that was enough, and so he's going to be out, and that's a big loss because that's their right back. We'll see what they're able to do as far as bringing other people in, but they've managed to just create enough chances for themselves and not commit major mistakes. The one major mistake they made was really that free kick at the very end that Germany was able to knock in, and that took a perfect shot in order to deny the Swedes at least a draw there. As far as England, I mean, look, the English, they've shown they can score. We know they have talent, and we've seen now that perhaps psychologically they aren't as burdened by the past as all of their fans and all of their media are. They get good attacking movement. They've got decent subs that'll come off the bench. They have one of the most informed goal scorers in the world right now in Harry Kane, and that's a huge thing, not just in terms of his ability to score from open play, but his size, makes him a real threat on set pieces. He's been just deadly from the penalty spot, not just in penalty kicks, but also in just regular spot shots that have come up. I think he's hit 3 or 4 of those so far in the tournament. That's a nice recipe for success. You worry a little bit about the back with England just because, you again, as I've mentioned before, you're playing at least one guy out of position. But, I really like what they've been able to do thus far. And I think that, certainly they have maybe a better chance than anybody on that side of the bracket to get to the final. And again, once you get there, anything's possible. So that would be my run-through on the various teams that are out there and their relative chances. Let's see. Some other questions that have popped up on Twitter. Let's get to... one of the things I did want to get to was this this controversy in the England Colombia game regarding Mark Geiger. And there was a tweet that was put out there earlier about, I think it was from Stu Holden from Fox, about, what do people, here, I'll just read the tweet. What's the verdict on Mark Geiger's performance last night in the England-Colombia match? And while watching the match, there was just a lot of invective being hurled at Mark Geiger, largely from the British media, but you also saw some people in the United States picking up on it and from other countries as well, that he was overmatched, that it just wasn't, like the moment was too big for him, so on and so forth. And, to me, I think there was a lot of overreaction because England was playing. And at the end of the day, my comment on this on Twitter was he could have done better, but it's folly to believe that any referee could have effectively prevented the anarchy. Teams have to be at least somewhat willing to adhere to normal behavior. And I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about that Colombia match. Look, you could make an argument that Geiger, should have come out and given a red card to somebody early on, but I think that's unrealistic. I mean, the idea, this is something to keep in mind with any sort of refereeing, is that ultimately most referees don't want to impose themselves on games, at least not in world football, I don't think. I've watched a lot of games over a lot of years, and generally speaking, you don't get a situation where referees really want to insert themselves into games. The problem comes when you get into a game when you've got two teams and at least one of the teams has decided that they're just going to unsettle the game as much as possible. And I think that, frankly, that's what Colombia set out to do certainly as soon as Kane got that, scored that penalty, but it also occurred long before that in the game, where if anytime there was a free kick, you would just have a lot of time wasting and a lot of ridiculousness that would come out of the Colombian players, which would then cause the England players to get upset, and then they would start doing ridiculous things. There's only so much you can do as a referee in that situation. And I'm sorry, I don't buy the idea that you drop a red card on somebody in a match of this importance, particularly if, you've got a team that's already missing one of their best players. It's tough because there's not enough disciplinary actions within a game like this that you can take without taking the ridiculous extreme of kicking somebody off the pitch entirely. And I really do think that, certainly there were a lot of England fans that felt like that's exactly what should have happened. And yeah, I can certainly understand the argument, but I also think that completely changes the tenor of the game. We saw that in the first game that Colombia played this tournament, where they get a red card 5 minutes in against Japan, and it changed the whole complexion of the game. And there's more and more hesitancy to do that the further and further you get into it. So look, I think there were probably some things that Geiger could have done, certainly much more actively to take control of the game, but I also think that was a game that had at least one team, and at the end of the day, both teams that were hell-bent on doing things in a way that the game was not intended to be played in. And so I think he'll probably ref again in this tournament, and I'll be anxious to see what happens, because you don't have a lot of teams left in the field that look overwhelmingly committed to doing that sort of thing. Like most of the teams that are in there right now, I feel like don't have that sort of a background, and we haven't seen that sort of play out of them. But you never know. We'll have to see. Let's see. We've got a couple of other comments and questions here that I wanted to get to before we move on to my predictions. Let's see, 1 second here. I have to load the tweets once again as I switched off the screen. We did have one comment on the Geiger stuff from Brett Pantaleo. Regarding Falcao saying the referee was favoring England as rich, the PK was earned, and he didn't give a straight red for the headbutt. If anything, he helped Colombia as much as he could have. Their play was shameful. I tend to agree with that. And there was a comment in the chat that I also generally agree with from Hobbit Brain. A red card should be shown if it is deserved in any game. Yes. But I also think that, so the red card instance that most people point to was the headbutt from the Colombian player. And as this is where you have to start parsing headbutts and so on and so forth. This was not like your traditional This was not a Zidane level headbutt by any stretch of the imagination. It was little things that created this negative atmosphere on the pitch. And I think that, when you start refereeing little things so severely, you risk creating even more anarchy on the field. And I just don't know that there was a good way, if you have teams operating in bad faith on the field, for any referee to handle it. It sounds like I'm doing this big defense of Mark Geiger. I'm really not trying to. I didn't think the game was particularly well refereed, but I didn't think it was the abomination that most people seem to think that it was. So anyway, a couple other items to talk about. We had a comment again from Craig. Assuming the favorites are France, Brazil, England, and Croatia, which one's most likely to be upset? I'll get to that one in a second. I think that that's an interesting point, and it actually feeds well into a question from Jason Kennedy. Rank your matches as per interest and or competitive nature. So let's just kind of slide right in on that one. Let's jump on the bracket here. So here's our bracket as it currently sits. And I want to go back and talk a little bit about the matches I'm most interested in, starting with the least and moving up to the most. So the one I think is probably the least interesting in terms of what it potentially gives us from a tactical perspective is Croatia versus Russia. In as much as I don't know that the Russians can do a whole lot except counterattack. They're going to be playing a Croatian squad that is probably in better shape mentally to handle them than the Spanish were. There really was something ill with Spain as the tournament progressed. Probably had a lot to do with the manager situation, but I think it also had to do with the generational changeover that's taking place with Spain. Croatia doesn't really have those issues. Croatia just got done playing a very tough game versus Denmark, but Croatia has shown an ability to, stretch play. And Russia really hasn't. So this might be a competitive game, but I don't think it's going to be a particularly interesting game to watch because I think if Croatia scores, it's going to be hard for Russia to figure out a way back into the game. I see that sort of a game playing out in a very similar style to how we saw Russia versus Uruguay playing out, where Uruguay scored early, then the Russians had to play catch-up, which didn't allow them to collapse defensively, which then allowed Uruguay more room, and that basically undid everything that the Russians were trying to do. So to me, that's the simple question here, is can Croatia figure out a way to unlock Russia early, pull them out of their defensive shell, and at that point, I think it's pretty elementary. So that actually is, I think that makes Croatia probably the least likely of the four favorites to be upset in this quarterfinal round, simply because I think they're playing the weakest of the competitors. Brazil-Belgium. This game, to me, it's interesting, but it's not interesting in the sense that I don't know that Belgium is ready to deal with what Brazil's going to bring to the table. Now, this is one I could be totally wrong on, and I do think that there's an argument to be made that Belgium has, certainly so much talent on the pitch, and this is where they're really starting to come together and figure it out. I look at it and I say to myself, well, the problem is Brazil's already got it figured out. And, as bad as the Brazilian performance was in 2014, they still got to the semifinals. As fractured as Brazil looked in 2014, they don't look fractured at all. They do look bored at times, or at least maybe a better way of putting it is they get distracted relatively easily, but then they are able to snap right to attention. And once they do that, they're very difficult to play against. There was a naivete in the way that Mexico played Brazil defensively, and I fear that we're going to see Belgium fall into that same level of naivete. The Belgian back line is certainly an excellent back line, but they're going to have to play at a level of physicality and on an arm's lengthness, to invent a term, that I don't know that they're mentally capable of doing against this Brazilian squad. You can't let Brazil get possession in your attacking third and then just buzz around the exterior. That's what undid Mexico after a period early on in the game where Mexico was pretty dominant. That went away very quickly once Brazil got control of the offensive final third. Belgium, certainly they have the talent all over the pitch to be able to maintain some possession themselves, and yet I need to see it happen for this Belgian squad first. They need to score early. They need to figure out a way to get Brazil on their heels a little bit, and I just don't know that you're going to be able to do that against this Brazilian side. It's a Brazilian side that is going to be really focusing heavily on, how to structure themselves so that they get possession forward to their front three, and so I'm expecting Neymar, Gabriel Jesus, and Willian to be out there. You've got the connective tissue of Coutinho and Paulinho on the flanks. You are missing Casemiro in this game, and that is going to be interesting to see how they handle that. Who do they put into that spot? But the back line is able to come forward and then move back, and we saw that back line gradually constrict the flow of play that Mexico was able to get. Mexico was able to go down the flanks and do a lot of good stuff there early, and then that gradually went away as the game went along. For Belgium, the shape that they set up in is really going to affect the way that they handle this game. What do? If they keep that back three, you're putting a lot of pressure on Ferreira, Carrasco, and Meunier, if those are indeed your starting wingers, to fall back and help out defensively. Or you're going to be asking Witsel and De Bruyne to have to basically play both ways, and that's something that I don't know that is conducive to, especially to De Bruyne's game. If there's that much pressure on the center, that link up between Alderweireld and Vertonghen and company on the back line, if that gets penetrated from the flanks, that's going to create real issues, because Belgium in their current shape, I don't think, has the right answers for that. So I look at this and I say, just on reputation alone of the players and on the talent levels in this should be a really good game. I think the problem ultimately is that I think that the way that Roberto Martinez has set up this Belgian side, while it's been effective so far, this is probably the wrong setup for Brazil. So if he comes out with a completely different setup, that I think is going to be a key component of Belgium challenging in this contest. But right now, that's only third on my list. France-Uruguay, I would say, is the second most interesting of these games. Now, this would have been my most interesting game, but there's an injury concern with Cavani. He didn't tear a muscle, from what I've heard, but he does have a problem with one of his leg muscles. He wasn't on the training pitch yesterday, and from all I've heard, it's going to be very difficult for him to go, period, in this game. And that really changes what Uruguay can do. They certainly still have Luis Suarez, although Suarez itself came up lame with a little bit of an injury in training. He's apparently, I think, going to be able to play. I would be surprised if he didn't, even if he's only at 80%. But if you take Cavani out of the lineup and you have at least a little bit hobbled Suarez, I don't think that bodes particularly well for this Uruguay squad, because they really don't have players of that caliber in their offensive attack coming off the bench. And keep in mind, this is an Uruguay side that only took 5 shots on goal against Portugal. So that they're very organized. They like to pick their spots, but so much of that has come down to Cavani and Suarez creating space wide that unlocks the opposition defense. And it's hard for me to see, unless Cavani makes a miracle comeback here, if it's just Suarez out there, I don't see where France ends up having the problems defensively that Portugal had. So, and France is also certainly much better than Portugal defensively in terms of their talent. The problem that France might have in this game is the Uruguay defense is itself very good. And, the problems that Deschamps' tactics have had in getting the ball forward, those seem to disappear against Argentina, but my theory is that that's more Argentina's lack of defensive awareness and also their extreme age defensively, keeping them from, being able to keep France out of the box. I don't think Uruguay is going to have that problem. I think Uruguay will be very, very focused defensively. I think that they'll be very much on the French offensive players anytime they're in the range of scoring position. So I think this game is going to be a fascinating chess battle. I don't think it's going to be a particularly good game to watch, because Uruguay, particularly if Cavani's out, is going to go in thinking we got to get to penalties. And I think they've got the talent to do so. France, I don't know that France is going to come out with the sort of urgency that says we got to score on these guys because we don't want to go to the randomness of a penalty shootout. But even if they do, I think that France would be happy with the penalty shootout because they would look at it and they would say to themselves, I think we're going to be able to handle this because we've got more and better shooters than Uruguay does. So I would not be surprised at all if this game goes the full 120 minutes. Last game, the one I think is the most interesting tactically, is Sweden-England. A lot of people seem to think that this England squad is already booked through to the semifinals. And yet, this Sweden squad has given them a lot of problems historically. I think England's they've lost 7 of their last 8 to Sweden or something ridiculous like that. And this is a Sweden side that's shown that they have the ability to triumph over more talented competition. They bested the Netherlands in qualifying. They beat Italy in that qualifying session. They almost beat Germany. They had the right tactical plan for that. And, I think there's a tremendous amount of sentimentality towards England making it to the semifinal or the final, particularly in the U.S., because so much of our World Cup news and our soccer news in general filters through England and English pundits. And certainly they're all on cloud 9 after that shootout versus Colombia. And look, I think that England certainly got as good of a chance as anybody to go through. I would just be very cautious of this because I think that the idea that, Sweden doesn't have attacking talent, they've sat behind the ball too much, England's going to be able to unlock them, Lingard and Kane and that whole group are going to really be able to handle things well. I would be very cautious about that style of thinking because this to me looks like the sort of game where England is going to get locked in one of those death grip struggles where neither squad is giving an inch and neither squad is able to gain an inch. I think that the problems that England had breaking down Colombia at times, I could see those actually being worse against Sweden because I think unlike Colombia, Sweden is much less likely to lose their cool. And that's ultimately, if you think about it, that's what gave England their first goal was, this idea that the Colombians had that they had to foul in the box and that it wasn't going to get called. I don't think Sweden's going to make that same mistake. So all that having been said, I'll go ahead and reveal my picks for the quarterfinals here. First of all, I'm going to go with France in that game versus Uruguay. I think this is coming down to PKs, and I think France ends up prevailing there, but you could flip a coin, frankly. And, I think Uruguay is going to play them very close. I think this is going to be a very difficult game for the French. But ultimately, I just think that, I don't think Uruguay's got enough to win it in regulation or in extra time if they don't have Cavani. And I think if Cavani was in, I'd probably pick Uruguay in this match. But because he's not, and because Suarez might be a little bit banged up, and because France does have so much talent, and because this is not the sort of game that is going to reveal or expose the problems that France's tactical approaches are going to have, I think France ends up winning this one. As far as the second game is concerned, I've got Brazil in it. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Brazilians are coming into their own. They look very good value for the rest of the tournament. And, I would really worry if I was Belgium about what I'm doing tactically in this game. If Belgium comes out, new style, if they don't concede at the back, and if they, play a more sober and pragmatic brand of football than they played in the last World Cup quarterfinal, they have a good chance. But even with that, I think it's going to be really hard for them to overcome this particular Brazilian side. So I'll take Brazil in this one, probably 2-0 or 2-1 in this contest. On the other side of the bracket, I do have Croatia coming out of the game versus Russia. I think the Russians can give them a game. And much as I said before, I wouldn't be shocked if somehow this got to PKs and the Russians were able to pull off another victory in penalties. But I really like the setup that the Croatians have going. I think against almost any other team in the tournament right now, I'd probably pick Croatia to lose. But against Russia, I think they're the better side. And so I've got them advancing. And then my final prediction, I went back and forth on this one a lot, and I'm not totally confident in it, but we'll go ahead and pick England in this game. Again, I think this is another game that could come to PKs. I just think these are very evenly matched teams in terms of what they bring to the table. Certainly England have more, I think, footballing talent at most positions, but I think Sweden are much better organized right now. And, the way that this World Cup has gone with so many goals coming off of set pieces, so many goals coming off of outside of the run of play, and the fact that England wasn't able to score during the run of play against Colombia, I think those are all clues that this is going to be a really, really tight game. And I don't think Sweden's going to concede easily. I don't think they're going to score easily either. So again, I could see this certainly going the full 120 minutes, and you could go either way in that. But I think England does advance. So again, my predictions on the semifinals will be France and Brazil on one side, Croatia and England on the other side, just like everybody thought, right? That's the thought process. A couple other questions here before we break up. Let's see, from Danimal on Twitter. My picks are France over Uruguay, Belgium over Brazil, Croatia over Russia, Sweden over England. Croatia and Belgium are my favorites to win the tourney right now. They've both played extremely well up to this point, respectively. Fair enough. I think Croatia's having a little bit of a crisis right now in terms of their form, but certainly I think you can look at aspects of both of these teams and say, wow, they are playing really well. And then we had one other question or / comment here from Michael Clausen. Spurs chemistry on England working better than people thought. No? Yes, it is. The Spurs players have linked up pretty well so far for England. They've linked up pretty well for Belgium too. It's kind of interesting. I mean, there's 3 Spurs players starting for Belgium. The 2 defensive players in Vertonghen and Alderweireld, and then Moussa Dembele. And then, of course, you've got Walker and Trippier and Kane and Dele Alli. Walker's no longer on Spurs, of course, but Trippier. But there is some chemistry that comes from those players having played as much as they played together over the course of time. But yeah, no, it's been fun to watch. I think if you're any Premier League supporter, you can find something to like out of this. We've seen good play out of Spurs players, out of Liverpool players, out of Man City players. There's been a lot to watch and enjoy so far in this tournament. Anyway, I think that wraps it up for us. We went almost an hour, so thanks to those of you who stuck with us the whole time. If you have questions or comments about anything moving forward, let me know. I'm taking tomorrow off. No podcast, no anything. But I'll be back starting on Friday. We'll recap the first round of quarterfinals. Just a reminder, the games taking place that day at the 10 o'clock hour here in the Eastern time zone of the United States. We've got Uruguay versus France. And then at 2 o'clock, we've got Brazil versus Belgium. And then on Saturday, Sweden versus England and Russia versus Croatia. The fact that that's the primetime game should make for quite a bit of drama as we go moving forward. Anyway, thanks again for everybody joining me here. And if you got questions, hit me up at Dr. GC. We'll catch you all on the flip side. So long, everybody.